The Little Western was suffering from a series of unfortunate events. Terrible storms had swept across the island, but Duck's branch line had felt the worst of it. The line had taken a real battering from huge waves and high winds. Sea defences had been ripped apart and left some parts of the line unprotected. As what was expected, train services had to be cancelled until the line had been inspected and the weather had improved. When the storms had passed, the line's bad luck still remained. The storms had damaged the turntable, and so the engines couldn't turn round. A landslide caused by foul weather soon halted trains again, and worse still, the passengers were beginning to complain about the state of the track. "Oh, it's almost like travelling on a bouncy castle," grumbled the passengers. The final straw was when Douglas had to run round his train at the station and his tender derailed at the points. "I can't cope with all this. The Little Western's being run to the ground." The Fat Controller decided to take action. He spoke to Duck, Donald, Douglas and Oliver at the sheds. "As you're all aware, the Little Western's going through a bit of a rough patch, so to speak," began the Fat Controller. "You can say that again," whispered Donald. "I've decided to take action. Workmen will arrive tomorrow to begin upgrading the track work, but with no turntable in service, I do not want Donald and Douglas running on the line until it is mended. So you two will return to the main line." "Aye, sir, no problem," said the twins. "The workmen will start on the run-round loop at the station." Duck interrupted. "But excuse me, sir, how am I meant to run round my passenger trains?" The Fat Controller gave Duck a serious look. "Daisy shall be in charge of your passenger services until the work is completed." Duck was very upset. "Daisy?" he spluttered. "The diesel rail car?" "Yes, she can be driven at both ends and doesn't need a run-round loop." But what about Oliver?" stuttered Duck. "I don't think I need to remind you that Oliver is an auto tank and doesn't need to run round either." The Fat Controller turned and left Duck speechless. Oliver and the twins couldn't help but laugh. The next day, the workmen arrived to begin the upgrade. Duck sulked in the shed as Daisy purred in. "Good morning, gentlemen," she tooted. Duck said nothing. Oliver was more polite. "Welcome, Daisy, to the Little Western." "Oh, thank you, my darling. You have such a beautiful line." "Oh, it is," replied Oliver, "but it's much nicer when we have sunnier weather." Daisy and Oliver happily chatted to one another when Daisy made an observation. "Oh, I hate to be an inconvenience, but may I sleep in the carriage shed tonight?" she asked. "Why?" huffed Duck firmly. "Well, my dear, soot, steam and smoke are bad for my swerves," explained Daisy. "And that would never do." "Rubbish! You can sleep in the engine shed." "Of course you can, Daisy," cut in Oliver. "I'm sure the coaches would be delighted of the company." Daisy smiled happily and rolled away to the station to collect her passengers. "I don't know how Thomas manages," snorted Duck. "For a diesel rail car, she's very high maintenance. She's doing us a favour, and we must be grateful for her help. It's all right for you, Oliver. You haven't been replaced by her. And for good reason. She won't be here for long, and the Fat Controller knows what he's doing," said Oliver. Duck couldn't argue with Oliver. He knew he was right. So instead he puffed away to collect his ballast trucks. Daisy enjoyed her first run on the line. It was a nice change from her usual work on Thomas's branch line. As she rolled smoothly into the station, she was surprised to see Oliver arriving into the other platform backwards. She learned a lot from the other steam engines about how they ran, thanks to Thomas, Toby and Percy, but she had never witnessed anything like this before. Dulcie was leading, followed by Isabel, and then Oliver. "What's going on?" she asked in bemusement. "Oh, I'm pushing my train," replied Oliver instantly. "Yes, I can see that, dear, but isn't that unsafe?" "Oh, not at all," explained Oliver. "I'm an auto tank, which means I can be driven automatically from the cabs of Isabel and Dulcie." Daisy was puzzled. "How?" "By pulleys and chains that are connected to the controls of the coaches to the controls in my cab. The driver can open my regulator, brake and pull my whistle from the coaches. Only the fireman stays to stoke the fire, check the water supply and intervene if he thinks anything's wrong." Daisy was very impressed. Coach is in charge of an engine. Well, 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 my dears, if you aren't very clever. You certainly put Annie, Claril, and Henrietta to shame. Isabel was flattered, but Dulcie stayed quiet. She didn't say a word. She looked almost scared. Daisy noticed this, but said nothing as she watched the unusual spectacle depart. That evening, Daisy arrived at the carriage shed. The coaches greeted her warmly, all except Dulcie. My dear, is something troubling you? She asked kindly. Dulcie still said nothing. Oh, come on, my darling, you can tell me. I can't, whispered Dulcie. He'll get cross if I do. Who will? Oliver? No. Mr. Clark. He'll get ever so cross if I tell you. There's nothing to be frightened of. Myself and the coaches are here for you, comforted Daisy. Dulcie took a deep breath and told Daisy everything. Before I was bought by the Fat Controller, I worked on the Great Western Railway. Oh, there was an awful driver who worked for the Great Western long before I was even built. He was known to everyone as Mr. Clark. Oh, he was a dreadful man. He was a heavy drinker and was known to be drunk on the footplate. He would drive at terrifying speeds and put his passengers' lives at risk. Oh, I hated the thought of him in my cab under the influence of alcohol. When nationalisation occurred, he was finally caught out and British Rail suspended him from the footplate. One evening, I was still coupled to an auto tank. He slipped into the yards. He was extremely intoxicated. He was cursing and shouting. He frightened me. He climbed into my cab and opened the regulator. But nothing happened. Angry and confused, he climbed down and walked ahead of me. Suddenly, the engine began to move. I tried to warn him, but there was nothing I could do. He was too drunk. He couldn't hear me shout. I closed my eyes and then... And then what? Gasped Daisy. I hit him, sobbed Dulcie. They took him to the hospital, but he was long gone by the time they got him there. All the crews began to blame me and said it was my fault, but it wasn't. That nasty man now haunts my cab. He's tried numerous times to drive me and Oliver away, but he's never succeeded. Yet, I've never seen him before, said Isabel. You probably have, murmured Dulcie. You just wouldn't have known it was a ghost. Daisy and the coaches said no more, but the diesel railcar could sense that they weren't alone anymore. The next day, all the coaches were still lost in their thoughts. The atmosphere began to change, and Dulcie felt very uncomfortable. At the station, Dulcie's cab door was left open. An inquisitive little boy looked inside. His curiosity got the better of him as he was fascinated by the controls of the cab. He stepped inside, when suddenly the door slammed shut behind him. He tried to open it again, but it was locked solid. The air went cold. The little boy turned around. He looked in horror to find a man glaring coldly at him. Petrified, the little boy screamed in sheer terror. Dulcie tried to grab the attention of Oliver, but it was too late. The guard blew his whistle, and off he went. Stop, Oliver, stop! There's a boy trapped in my cab! She cried. Suddenly the emergency cord was pulled and Oliver screeched to a stop. What's going on? Called Oliver. The boy's mother had pulled the cord. The driver, fireman and guard rushed to Dulcie's cab. Her doors won't open, said the guard. At last the doors gave in and the little boy sprinted into his mother's arms. There was a man in there, sobbed the boy. He didn't want to let me go. Everyone was very confused. They had all seen no one with the boy, but all agreed to attend to the matter when they reached the top station. Dulcie felt very upset. When they arrived at the top station, the crew, along with the boy and his mother, went to the station master's office to investigate the matter. As the train stood waiting, Dulcie could feel someone moving around her cab. She shuddered in disbelief. Suddenly, Oliver began whistling loudly on his own. His shrill whistle blasted through the station. Everyone was very surprised. So too were his crew, who ran to their engine. They checked his cab, but no one was there. Look! The fireman pointed to the chain connected to Oliver's whistle. Someone's blowing the whistle of Dulcie's cab! The crew charged at Dulcie's cab, but when they arrived, the whistling stopped, and Dulcie's cab was found empty. It doesn't make any sense, snapped the driver. There's no one there. Isabel whispered to her friend. Dulcie, it isn't... I think it is, quivered Dulcie. It's Mr. Clark. Wary and confused, the driver took his place in Dulcie's cab and the fireman in Oliver's. Both coaches and engine were very nervous as they reversed back down the line. When they reached the next station, Oliver had to take on water. His driver stepped down from Dulcie and pulled on the water tower's chain whilst the fireman stood on Oliver's tanks. As the operation was carried out, Daisy arrived coming the other way. As she entered the platform, she nearly shrieked in horror. There, standing in Dulcie's cab, was a pale figure of a man. He had his hand on the regulator. Daisy tooted in alarm. There's an intruder in Dulcie's cab! Suddenly he threw open the regulator. Oliver responded with a will and shot backwards. Help! He cried! The fireman scrambled into Oliver's cab and braked hard. Everyone was very surprised and shocked. Dulcie was in tears. I knew I shouldn't have said anything, she cried. Right, scoffed Daisy. We'll soon stop that nonsense. And she hurried away. That night, Daisy stood waiting. We'll get rid of this Mr. Clark once and for all. The coaches were not too sure. I'm not convinced this will work, said Dulcie. Darling, he doesn't scare me. I will not tolerate his reckless and irresponsible actions. The coaches were impressed by Daisy's defiance, but were still frightened at what might happen. As time went by, the coaches began to fall asleep one by one, until at last, Daisy fell asleep too. No sooner had she shut her eyes, when footsteps could be heard in Dulcie. Dulcie woke up immediately. Daisy! Daisy, wake up! I think he's here! The air grew colder. One of her doors flew open and then slammed shut violently. It woke Daisy up. They all waited with bated breath. Finally, the sight of a pale man staggered in front of them. He looked at Daisy and the coaches in a threatening manner. Daisy glared back at him. She held her ground. You're not wanted here, Mr. Clark. How dare you haunt this poor coach after all the suffering you put her through? The coaches had all lost their voices in fright. Mr. Clark stepped forwards. You're a pathetic excuse of a man who led a pathetic excuse for a life. And even now, in the afterlife, you are a pathetic excuse of a ghost. Mr. Clark continued to stagger forwards. Not one more move, or I'll see to it that you are sent back to where you belong. Mr. Clark began to growl as he continued forwards. Be gone and leave us in peace. Mr. Clark suddenly leapt forwards. Daisy hooted her horn in horror. Duck and Oliver woke suddenly from inside their shed. What is going on? Puffed Duck. Daisy and the coaches had shut their eyes. When they opened them, Mr. Clark was nowhere to be seen. The shed didn't feel cold anymore. They were shaken, but relieved he was gone. The shed-master came to see what all the commotion was about. Not to worry, my dear, soothed Daisy. Just a little pest control. It's all sorted now. Over the next couple of days, there were no more sightings of Mr. Clark. Dulcie felt better in herself, and there were no more strange incidents. When the appointment was complete at the station, Daisy and the coaches told Oliver and Duck what happened. They were taken aback by what they heard. Why didn't you tell me? Asked Oliver. It wasn't a nice thing to talk about, muttered Dulcie. Where do you think Mr. Clark has gone? Perhaps he's finally done the honourable thing and moved on so you can finally be at peace. Even ghosts have guilty consciences. The coaches were sad to see Daisy go. They were all grateful to Daisy, Dulcie especially. When she left, Duck turned to Oliver. For a diesel rail car, I completely underestimated her. Oliver could only agree.